Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com program, brought to you by TechStrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. You will receive an email with a link to access this recording on demand, and it should be available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. Over on the right side of the screen, you'll see a few more options. The first one is the chat tab, and we'd like you to use that for more general discussion. You can start off by letting us know from where you're tuning in or what role you play in your org. And we will have a couple of polls throughout today's program, so we do want your participation there. And as always, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So the topic of our discussion today is Kubernetes cost avoidance implementing FinOps. And I'm joined by Elisa Hebert, Vice President of Engineering Operations at Fairwinds, Andy Suderman, CTO at Fairwinds, and John Hashem III, Senior Solutions Architect at Fairwinds. So John, Andy, Elisa, thank you all so much for joining me. Andy, do you want to go ahead and get us kicked off?
Definitely. Thanks for the great intro, as always. So, as Cody said, we are here talking about Kubernetes cost avoidance, implementing FinOps. So, if you're not interested in Kubernetes and not interested in FinOps, maybe not the right place to be. Time to jump out. But we'll just jump right into some more in-depth intros. So, Elisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Elisa Hebert, VP of Engineering Operations at Fairwinds. So I support the software and services teams. In the last year, got FinOps certified and was super excited about it because it sort of pulls together the things I love most, which are efficiency and finance and spreadsheets, and sort of overlays that into the engineering organization. So hits that sort of sweet spot in my Venn diagram of interest. So I'm excited to chat today about how to move that needle.
All right. And that says Robert Brennan, but my name's Andy Suderman, and I am the CTO here at Fairwinds. I'm coming at this from the Kubernetes side. I have about 7 years of experience in Kubernetes and many more in sysadmin and Linux administration and different things like that. And I also got FinOps certified mostly so that I could understand what Elisa was talking to me about after she got FinOps certified, so that I can understand the terminology and the way that we think about things. But it has been an interesting journey, and definitely fun to apply my knowledge of Kubernetes to that side of it. So I'll hand it over to John to introduce himself.
Cool. Thanks, Andy. John Hashem, Solution Architect here at Fairwinds. I guess I'm the odd one out, and I need that badge, so I got to get after it here. But my role is to help customers accelerate their journey on Kubernetes through our software platform, just Fairwinds Insights, which we'll chat about a little bit later. I'll pass it over back to you, Andy.
All right. And then we all work at Fairwinds. And so if you're not familiar with Fairwinds, Fairwinds is a trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. We help our customers ship cloud-native applications faster and provide software that simplifies complexity in Kubernetes and helps unify your dev, security, and ops teams, and your FinOps teams if you have that. We should probably add that into our mission statement. So we'll jump right in here to a polling question. So where are you at in your Kubernetes journey? Are you just learning about containers in Kubernetes? Are you planning to use it in 6 to 12 months? Are you using it only in testing and development environments? Or are you using it in production? I'll give that a second to give you all a chance to answer. Elisa, where are you at in your Kubernetes journey?
I use it to run all of my OIT stuff in my house.
Oh, really?
No.
I'm impressed. I don't do that. All right. Looks like the majority of people here are using it in production. That explains why you're all here, because you started using it in production and quite likely found out that it costs more than you expected, or you need to control those costs or understand those costs. And so we're looking for strategies, hopefully, to do that. And so hopefully we can give you some good advice today. So we'll go back to the slides. There we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what this FinOps thing is. Like, why is it important, and what does it mean? So, Lisa, you've recently gotten FinOps certified. Can you tell us a little bit about what is FinOps and why it's important?
Sure. So FinOps is basically the practice of trying to identify unit costs around your cloud spend and pulling together the different sort of silos in an organization, especially in a bigger organization, to have that conversation in sort of a centralized way. So from sort of the engineering side, it is making sure that there's level of visibility so that the individual contributors on up through management and leadership understand the impact of their their work and what their cloud usage looks like and how that translates into cost profile that hits the P&L. So it's bringing in the finance folks on that side of the conversation. So as we are very likely entering a recession or at the beginning part of a little bit of a downturn here, it's even more important because folks are really carefully analyzing what they're spending money on, looking at their tooling, looking at the cost of your cloud footprint, and being able to understand why things cost what they cost, what is the unit cost, and I can talk a little bit more about that for different metrics, and how you think about when increases are important and matter and when they're actually aligned with your business. So for example, here at Fairwinds, looking at our unit costs, we look at sort of cloud spend per cluster that is managed. We look at spend per customer, and we slice it a couple of different ways. And that lets us see, if our overall bill is going up, is that because we have increased our feature set? Is that because we have increased our customer footprint? Is that because we've expanded our customers or, in individual customers to have a bigger footprint per? If one is going up and the other is staying flat or going down, that's real signal to pay attention to. So it is an ongoing process. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here, but it definitely gives visibility across the organization.
Cool. Awesome. So are there is there a set of core tenets or driving things, like some bullet points or individual things that we should think about when we're thinking about FinOps?
Sure. So, you can find these online, but it's around, I'm not going to sort of read them bullet by bullet, but it's around collaboration, understanding the business value of the cloud, ownership of usage, accessibility and timeliness of information, centralization, talked about that a little bit already, and then being able to understand and then take advantage of the variable, cost model that you can find in the cloud versus, buying and stacking servers somewhere in your basement.
Right. Yeah. And so, talking about the cloud, FinOps isn't really a new thing. We've been dealing with costs in the cloud and the variable cost and, constantly expanding costs in the cloud. John, you're ultimately familiar with this, not just from Fairwinds, but your previous job as well. What is it about Kubernetes that makes this more difficult or different than it was before we had Kubernetes and we just had cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the difference here is as you look at whether it's containers or some type of abstraction, those really remove some of the artifacts that folks are familiar with. So when they look at a build, they're looking at like a cost of an instance. They can see like an instance ID, or they can see a volume that they're familiar with, or at least they have that tagged in their cloud environment. What Kubernetes introduces as another layer of abstraction, and also things are generally short-lived. So nodes are here today, they're gone tomorrow, and that becomes difficult to track when you're looking at cloud costs. And in turn, those resources are shared. So that's really tricky to allocate to things that Lisa mentioned, such as a cost per customer, cost per team or different environments. And that in turn, kind of drives complexity in the organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just injecting another abstraction layer between, the cloud API and what you're actual, deploying and running.
Absolutely.
Cool. Awesome. So, we talked about the challenges of, the differences really of FinOps in Kubernetes versus FinOps in the cloud. They're just the cloud. But what are some of the, additional, what are the most important challenges that we see and the hardest to tackle? I think we talked about it a little bit, but is there more to elaborate on there, John?
Yeah, there's two that come to mind. The first one is, the way that, clusters are kind of separated today. So there's a concept, just, one of many, called a namespace, which is kind of an isolation construct in your cluster that you can kind of isolate resources, whether they're, applications or teams or, different environments, kind of like a virtual cluster. And that is tricky because they're, across different nodes, and nodes are those pieces that you're tracking in your build. So the more, you have a kind of a one-to-many relationship, those are difficult to track. The other is scaling. So, Kubernetes is always adding more resources as you need them, which is great because it makes, folks' lives easier, because Kubernetes is like, hey, you need another one? I got you. I'll add another node or add, another pod or what have you, to make the environment more either highly available or more scalable when you're, throwing traffic at it. But that in turn drives cost, since everything in the cloud is metered. And in turn, that's why finance is knocking at the door. So you want a real easy way to say, this application is costing us X. And in turn, that drives confidence in the organization, which in turn will drive that migration. So when you're moving more resources to a Kubernetes environment, finance is extremely confident in what things are costing the organization, and in turn will drive more applications to Kubernetes, because that confidence is there.
That makes a lot of sense. And, you mentioned talking to the finance team. I think something to think about here is how do you talk to your finance team? Because our finance team they don't know how Kubernetes works. They don't know what Kubernetes is. They don't know, what it looks like. So how do we really communicate the costs to finance? At least I know you spent some time at Fairwinds doing that recently. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think, it depends on the size of the organization, but, especially in bigger organizations, there's this sort of old model of to spend money, you make a business case and you present it to finance or procurement, and then you go around a little bit and you get approval, and then you go and you spend, millions of dollars on something, or depending on what you're doing, can be, meaningful money. And this is a very different model, because it literally changes over the course of the day what your spend can be. Never mind, quarter by quarter or in an annual budgeting sort of way. So I think that one of the things I like the best about this FinOps model, and was so compelling to me when I saw it, is it forces the conversation between the business and engineering, in terms of coming together to say, okay, I'm finance and these are the constraints that I have, and I need to understand and be able to forecast and budget. And, in a publicly traded company, I have to be able to do this for our stockholders. And in a startup, I have to know what our runway looks like, right? We can't just have these unexpected costs come out of nowhere. So that's really good for the engineering side of the organization to be able to get that larger context and increase their business acumen. And then on the other side, really partnering with finance to say hey, this is why it's variable. This is what we can forecast. This is how we can create some, guardrails around our spending. And here's the opportunity that this cloud model really presents in terms of our ability to scale our product or grow, our customer footprint, et cetera. So I really love it from that perspective, because I think that it sort of crushes silos and encourages partnership across the organization in a way that I haven't, seen a lot of other models do.
Yeah. Definitely. One of the things that's been interesting to me is, being on the highly technical side of that conversation and learning, like you said, having more exposure to the business, being able to get involved in that more and understanding the needs on that side, and then reconciling those with the technology needs, which is really, the ultimate job of the CTO in this case is to understand the technical and reconcile that with the business. And it's really been an interesting journey getting to do that. So having somebody on that technical side that can really understand the technical deeply and then translate that into, business needs and translate it into something that people who don't necessarily need to understand Kubernetes can understand is super important. So, all right. Let's jump on to the next one. Having the talk. How do you talk to engineers about managing costs? Because engineers just want to deploy stuff, right? I just want to write code and I want it to go out there and I don't care how much it costs and it needs to run. So John, how, you work with our customers a lot. You talk to them about, their costs. How do you have this conversation with developers and help them understand cost?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to talk about with engineers or users or actually developers as far as deploying infrastructure is kind of not only the transparency, but ideally the impact. So Andy mentioned just want to deploy things, get it out, and let the stuff go and have your applications up and running. But ideally there's kind of an impact to everything that you're deploying, not only to cost, right? It's everything's metered, the bill goes up, the bill goes down. But there's another side of it that finance is thinking about is they look at the spill and, as Elisa mentioned, they're forecasting, what does this look like as we onboard more customers? But there's obviously the construct of cloud commitments. So when you're hedging your bets and saying, I'm going to save, 20 to 40% if I commit X dollars to the cloud provider in exchange for a discount, if you're not, allocating your resources correctly or over provisioning, finance is taking those numbers, not knowing and just saying hey, we're using this amount, let's make that bet. But meanwhile, you're betting on an incorrect kind of behavior, and that type of conversation needs to be talked about to users and engineering. They need to understand that their behavior ultimately drives profitability organization, because there's a lot of times where if you're making incorrect cloud commitments, that can actually cost you more than using on demand or pay-go in your cloud providers, which is extremely dangerous, right? You're spending way more than you should by hedging your bets incorrectly. So that's kind of a big thing is to institute is just talk about impact. I think it'd be good too to kind of understand maybe from Elisa's purview is, how do we do that at Fairwinds? What does that look like today?
So one of the things going through, learning about FinOps, and there is the material is dense. It's not quick to learn, and there's a lot there. But they have this idea of crawl, walk, run, which I like in all aspects of learning new things. But we're still in some ways in the somewhere between maybe we're cruising. For those of you who have little kids, that this is when they hold on to the furniture to learn how to walk. They can't actually walk on their own yet. We're certainly not running, but we're a little better than crawling. Sorry, my dog in the background there. So the very first thing we did was just look at all of the data and try and look at what units make sense to us. So I went into our AWS bill and pulled a bunch of data from there. I went into our Datadog and pulled a bunch of data from there. I went into Insights, our tooling, and pulled some data from there. And then on the other side, I looked at, what's our customer count? What's our cluster count? What's our node count? What's our revenue to cost ratio, things like that. And we did a lot of trial and error. We looked at all these numbers and what's the signal? Because, just like with, coding, you can have pages and pages and pages of code, and it can be great or it can be not great. Right. So we could create lots of metrics to look at, and I could measure them and I could feel like I was doing something, but if the metrics don't mean anything, that's just, useless. So we've had a lot of conversations over the last couple quarters about what are the right metrics? Why do they matter to us? And how do we create visibility in the organization so that both on the finance or the business side and on the engineering side, people understand what metrics we're looking at and why we're looking at them, and what the impact of the decisions that individual engineers make are on those numbers. So, some of that is just bringing more people to the conversation and having that sort of centralized group where it's like, Andy and I are in that conversation. We've got an engineer from the, infrastructure team managing insights. We have our CFO, we have VP of development, we have a couple of developers, just having a really broad footprint so that the conversation is robust and is cross-functional, both, horizontally and vertically in the organization. That's sort of our first step.
Yeah. The way I think about FinOps, obviously coming from the sysadmin side of things long ago and, living through the DevOps movement, it's an extension of that. It's not about necessarily, I mean, at the end of the day, we want to save money, but it's not about saving money. It's not about, controlling costs necessarily. It's about understanding and bringing teams together. And it's about that cultural shift where we're all in that conversation, having it, and we're relaying information that we all understand together, and we're understanding the metrics together. I asked Elisa the other day, I said, our cloud cost is not that high. Like it's not massive. It's not huge, especially relative to other costs that we have. It's relatively low. So are we spending too much time talking about this? And I think, you gave me a really good answer. If you want to share that here today. I
don't remember what I said. You can't say I said something smart and then not tell me what it was.
Well, I mean, we came to the conclusion that it's much more about understanding the cost and keeping track of our unit cost increase over time to make sure it's not going wild, right? So that we don't get into a place where we look back and say, oh no, like now we're spending way too much and we have to throw on the brakes and figure out how to save. We can, have these conversations now and upfront and come together around it, instead of it being, the way it was before was that our CFO would come to me every month and say, why is our cloud bill going up? And I would, look at it and I'd make some explanations and give it back to her. And that was a recurring theme every month. And it wasn't productive. It wasn't useful. And now we're coming at it from a much better perspective. So.
Yeah, I think, the sort of legacy model of the business versus engineering shows up in a lot of ways here. And I talked about this earlier, but I really like the way that this breaks down silos and forces partnership, because, I've definitely in my career heard a lot of my CFO won't let me. And my answer to that is you need to build a better business case then. You need to learn how to build a better business case, right? And then on the finance side, it's why costs out of control? People aren't paying attention to it. Well, no, you need to teach people about why it matters and how their actions, affect the cost profile of the organization. So I really like that.
Yeah, just to add something to that as well is, when you think about cloud bills, and since they're metered, a lot of the behavior that people are talking about talking about saving money as one example, that eventually there's so much savings to be had, is if you look at savings in the past, that money's gone. It's spent. So if you don't have a regular cadence on, some type of transparency within the business, you need to be able to procure those savings, because you really only have a month to do so. Then you're paying for it, PO's cut, money's gone. So you want to make sure you have some type of cadence with your teams cross-functioning in the organization to be able to procure those savings, but also understand some of those raw costs.
Yeah, great point. All right, shall we move on to the more practical bits? I think we could call it, maybe, instead of all of this philosophy we've been talking here. I don't know. I think it's all practical, but what do we do? How do we do this FinOps thing beyond just building good relationships and talking about it? What do we do?
So in terms of this first point, right, it's not one and done. Just like with anything, someone's got to own it, or else it it falls to the bottom of everybody's list and everyone's like, I thought you were doing that. So here at Fairwinds, I own it. That doesn't mean I do it all. It just means that I'm the person who sort of keeps the cadence. Some of it's like project management related, right? Like I own the spreadsheet. I update it on a regular basis. I set the meetings and, things like that. But that's sort of the basis of it, because it is not one and done. It is something that it's a practice. It's not an activity that is completed. And as you mature the practice, you go from crawling to cruising to walking to jogging to running, right? I think there's maybe a couple steps in between crawl, walk, run. But really sort of each time we meet, we say, we go through sort of a list of things that people had been working on, and people give updates, and we look at the numbers together, and we look at the unit costs, and we say, is this reasonable? Why not? Why is this happening? What can we do to mitigate it if we think it's challenging? And, to Andy's point, is the cost of mitigation worth it? Are you going to, get out the other side savings that are equal to or better the amount of money you spend to find those savings? And that is really, really important, because you can spend 2 weeks of work. This is what we were talking about yesterday in our FinOps meeting. Like, you can spend 2 weeks of work to develop something that saves you maybe $500 a month. Is that worth it? Long-term, maybe, but short-term, certainly not. You're not going to realize that cost savings for a pretty long time if you think about the cost of developing the change to do it. So it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing conversation, and having leadership around it is super important.
Yeah. To that point, what you were just saying there about, understanding the cost of making the changes versus what you save. I think the important thing there is that you're making that decision knowingly. You're not inadvertently making the decision by sheer luck. You consciously made that decision. And, we did that recently. It's like the opportunity cost of features that we want to add to our software is not worth the development time to develop these other processes. So I think that's really important. They're moving on to, some of the more tactical things as well. There's native tooling in places that can help you understand your costs and things like that. John, can you talk a little bit about that? I know you have a lot of experience there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that journey starts off with native tooling, as Elisa mentioned, looking at things like, Cost Explorer, and that's a great tool from AWS is one example. There are many of, across the different cloud providers, but that really helps with understanding the usage and some of those individual line items that are being consumed on the bill. But there's kind of that natural construct I talked about earlier of things like labeling and tagging, of course. So when you start to look at the abstractions of Kubernetes, that's super tricky because there's depending on how you have your clusters set up, where if you're a SaaS company like Fairwinds, each customer, could be a piece of that cluster. And that's where you want to make sure you might have the understanding of, hey, we want to look into those costs, but if you're not putting a tag or a label on it, that's really going to be important. So you might have the practices in place across the organization to understand of how you want to understand cost. For example, if it's a multi-tenant platform and each customer is a piece of that cluster, you know exactly how you want to slice it up. But the journey to get there, you need a way to put a sticker on the door, a tag on a chair. Like, you need a way to find those individual pieces. And that is extremely tricky because there's a couple of ways that those tags can get into the bill or labels. It could be through a manual deployment. It could be part of your CI process. So the more times you miss those, that kind of financial transparency gets really gray because you don't have a way to measure and track that. And that's why that's extremely important because that's going to be part of that journey.
Yeah, definitely. And this further exacerbates the problem of Kubernetes in your cloud environment, right? Because I can enforce tagging on instances natively through AWS,
right?
But I can't enforce labeling your deployments in Kubernetes necessarily, or labeling your namespaces or anything like that. It's something we've been struggling with a lot in our journey is trying to really understand unit cost per customer within the cluster, because it's, one auto scaling cluster. We talked about that problem, but I don't know how much of, my compute, my network costs, my storage costs, each customer costs me. We've had to get kind of creative with it. We're adding, information to logs and, using our Datadog tooling to sort of understand, how much information a customer is sending us, because we have, data collection in our platform. And, it's hard, it's tricky, and definitely tough to do. And we've really had to try and let perfect not be the enemy of good enough in this case, because, just some idea of unit cost is better than having no clue whatsoever. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a conversation with the customer a few weeks back, and one of the things that they were concerned with is they wanted to deploy more tooling, like monitoring and different things, but that's ultimately, has a cost to each node that it goes on. So they want to understand kind of that impact. So you really labeling, you need a way to kind of figure some of that out, because it's great to have more tools, but if you don't understand some of that cost or overhead to the business, that's kind of an underlying, piece that needs to be included in your larger kind of cost strategy. So just kind of a example that came to mind here.
Yeah. I mean, that brings to mind some of the low-hanging fruit in Kubernetes that you can kind of pick off. I think you alluded to using namespaces. I think one common anti-pattern when jumping into Kubernetes is I'm just going to deploy everything into one namespace. Which really kind of limits your ability to slice and dice the Kubernetes costs up front.
That's for sure.
Definitely using multiple, one namespace per anything. If we deploy a cluster add-on like external DNS, it goes in its own namespace. If we deploy, a new application, it goes in its own namespace. And I think, namespaces are cheap is the saying we've always had around Fairwinds, and I think that's very true.
Yeah, I think it's nice that Kubernetes gives you a starting point, gives you a few, gives you default out of the box, but it doesn't necessarily mean put everything in there. But we've seen a few times, so glad you brought that up.
Definitely seen it before, definitely. And then, Kubernetes has a common labeling scheme that they suggest. It's in the Kubernetes documentation that says, here's some standard labels that you should put on everything. And I think as Kubernetes has gotten more mature, we've definitely seen that become more ubiquitous, and like default Helm charts incorporate that now. And so if you do a Helm create just to start a new Helm chart, it automatically adds those labels for you. And so we're definitely getting better at that, but it's very much slow progress over the last 8 years that Kubernetes has existed now. So cool. Wow. And then the last thing that I'll talk about just a little bit, because it's kind of the thing that I always harp on. It's like if I had a mantra, it would be set your resource requests and limits. But application right sizing is a tricky thing. How much CPU and memory do I give my applications? First, we have to set resource requests and limits, because Kubernetes lets you just deploy stuff with no CPU requests, no memory requests, no memory limits. And so the first thing we have to do is set those. And, we're going to show some tools here in a little bit that might help you do that in your clusters. And then setting them correctly, which we're also going to talk about more. But I think those two things are the really important. It's kind of the baseline of Kubernetes, because it auto scales based on those requests and limits. And so controlling your costs, it really comes down to, at the end of the day, shrinking those down to an appropriate number. Not as small as possible, because then you might affect performance, but shrinking those down. All right. I think we've exhausted that slide, huh? Okay. Oh, and jumping straight into right sizing and tooling and open source. So Fairwinds has a couple of things that can help you with your resource requests and limits and right sizing your applications. And then also, some of the other things we talked about, enforcing labeling and things like that. But the first one is Goldilocks. That's an open source tool that we have released probably about 3 years ago now. And it ties into the vertical pod autoscaler, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's a Kubernetes add-on made by the same community that made the cluster autoscaler, that allows you to automatically vertically size your pods, which means setting your resource requests and limits. And now Goldilocks layers on top of that and uses it as a recommendation engine. So it looks at the historical usage of your workloads and suggests changes based on that. It may be saying that you need more because your application's being throttled, or it's getting killed, OOM killed, out of memory killed frequently. But it will also suggest when you're way over provisioned, which is probably the more common thing that we see is folks say, oh, my MacBook has 64 gigs of memory. That's how much my pod needs. Well, that's probably more memory than your pod needs. My little Go binary probably only needs a very small amount of resources to keep running. So making those suggestions and watching that stuff over time, and it can provide that all in a nice dashboard. So that's the open source, which I am a maintainer of. Happy to answer any questions. If folks have them, please drop them in the Q&A. But John, can you talk a little bit about our SaaS offering, Insights?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andy. So we have a commercial offering called the Insights platform, and it kind of takes some of the pieces that Andy mentioned as far as one of the open source tools, Goldilocks, and helps you kind of scale some of that information, not only for deploying across all of your clusters, but also how to view some of that data. And we'll talk about that in a demo in a moment here. But that is something where teams tend to struggle kind of at scale. So when you look at one cluster, it's great. You deploy a Helm chart or you have a couple of tools and you look at a dashboard or two. But when you start to think about, financial operations or, FinOps across the organization, and you want to, create patterns or standards across different environments, it's really tricky to do that at scale. Your policies tend to not be consistent. You might not have an understanding of all of those costs across the organization, and that's where Insights kind of helps take over. So when teams start to struggle with those, that's where the platform steps in. And my role at Fairwinds is to help accelerate your journey here. So always happy to talk about the platform, but we'll showcase a demo in a little bit.
Awesome, thanks, John. All right, we're going to throw up another polling question here, so that you don't get too bored listening to us talk. You can interact here. So what is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Is it getting help with the basics? Is it a general best practices assessment? Is it improving the security posture of your clusters? Is it saving money? Maybe that's why you're here today. Or is it improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes? I'm going to answer A. I could use some help. Seriously, though, there's no end of learning new things about Kubernetes. It's just every day, new stuff. It's wild.
I'm actually curious what people answer here.
Me too. And then we have a question from the audience that I'm going to answer. All right. Looks like most folks are here looking for improving reliability. And I think that's really interesting because, well, not most. Actually, I read that wrong, didn't I? Improving the security posture is top. Well, Insights can help with both of those, but I think the reliability one is interesting because resource requests and limits not only help you control costs and make sure that they're reasonable, but it also improves reliability because if your app's, constantly being throttled or, constantly crashing because it can't get enough resources, then, right sizing works in both directions, not just down, it works up as well. So super interesting there. So we have a question from the audience about Goldilocks that I'm happy to answer. So the question is, if you're not using a VPA, will Goldilocks help in learning what the static resource limits should be? Or will Goldilocks help by ingesting information from the VPA? So Goldilocks actually manages the vertical pod autoscaler objects for you. It will create one for each workload in your cluster, and it keeps it in what I call recommendation mode, or the update mode equals off in the VPA. And so it uses that as the recommendation engine and basically ingest that information and display it to you. So I think hopefully that clarifies the way Goldilocks works there. All right, and I'm going to kick it over to John. He's going to give us a demo of Fairwinds Insights. John, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. Let's see how we're doing here. All right, how are we looking?
Good.
Good. All right. Need the confirmation here. So
took a second there, but we got it.
Excellent. So we're going to walk you through the Insights platform and walk through some of the pieces today that I find to be important. As you probably saw earlier, some of the things that were mentioned about best practices, reliability, security. Those are all the things that we're touching upon within the Insights platform. And we can show you where the data is coming from and how the data is ingested. We'll first kind of start off with a quick overview of our cluster page. This is a representation of all the clusters that we're taking into account across security, efficiency, and reliability. And we're providing a health score as well. So this is kind of like how are you doing within Kubernetes? Are you on the right track? Are you trending in the right direction? So you can help understand kind of impact. Are you making the right decisions? Are you fixing the right things? And we're making that fairly easy to do across your environments. And this health score is another way to look at critical, high, and low, and medium items in your environment, along with things that are passing as well. We're going to jump right into the efficiency tab today, especially we're talking about FinOps and kind of what that means. We'll start off with capacity. So this is a real interesting one here. When we think about capacity in Kubernetes, there's a couple of things that come to mind. You want to know exactly what's being provisioned, and that includes the different nodes that are within your cluster. So every node kind of makes up this large kind of blue bar here, and that's what we call capacity. So that's the amount of kind of resources you have available to you at that time. This is shown at an hourly cadence as well, or you can look at it a 30-day view. You can look at the total amount of requests. So we were talking about earlier, when you tell Kubernetes, like, here's how much resources I think I need. This is where we're looking at all of the requests across your environment. And then this kind of dark blue black bar here, this is what you're actually using. So ideally, you want the light gray to be closer to what you're using, because that's what Kubernetes is using, is that light gray bar to say how many nodes that you need to run all of these workloads. So for example, when Kubernetes doesn't have enough room and a pod is in a pending state, Kubernetes says, all right, we need a new node to add to a node pool, and that in turn schedules that pod onto that new node, and that's where a lot of your costs come from. That new node is going to cost money, and this is what we're representing here. We're also kind of go ahead, Andy.
Oh, I was gonna say that red line's making me nervous. That's your
yes.
total limits, right? And that's like way beyond requests here, which is scary to me. But anyway.
Yes, I did miss that. So one thing is, within request, that's kind of what you need, and then the limits is saying the max amount that I need, and it's always going to be higher because you want to burst up to your limit. So in an aggregate, that's going to be a much higher number. But visually, this gives you a quick way to represent the total amount of resources. And then we'll take a look at kind of your cost over time. Ideally, in a production environment, it's probably a little bit more shaky, but over time, you can see what the cost of a cluster would be. And then below, we can take a look at your capacity over time. So this is a great way to represent, are you scaling up? Are you scaling down? And last is utilization. So making sure that if you are provisioning a lot of resources, that you're utilizing the most amount of your cluster. We have a lot of customers who are trying to track to a particular KPI, and this is a great one to measure against because it's going to go up and down over time. It's going to have ebb and flows, but you at least can understand what a metric you should be achieving, and that way you know that if you're paying, X dollars for a cluster, you're utilizing the most amount of that money, and that's where you move away from, saving money, which is obviously going to be a vehicle that you want to institute, but this is more utilizing what you're paying for, which is a kind of a core part of FinOps.
I have a question for you. Is there a common utilization number that you see from folks that they're trying to target for that KPI, or is that, kind of variable based on their situation?
It's definitely variable. Most of the time we're seeing usually 60 to 80% is fairly common. with a particular type of KPI, because when you start to get into the upper bounds of 80+%, then you get into you needing more capacity, and that's something where you don't want to be hitting the upper bounds. You want to have some type of headroom accounting for resources that are scaling up or things like that. So great point. All right, now we got another part of the journey, which is this is a brand new release. Oh, actually, I should probably go to here. It's already loaded to the platform, which is our cost allocation feature. And this is kind of a much lower level detail on understanding the cost of a cluster, of a namespace, of a workload, based on particular time windows or time horizons. And we can bring in things like the AWS cost and usage report to help drive the actual cost that we're seeing here today. As we're looking at this particular graph, we're seeing the cost over time is going down, which is obviously great to see in the organization. And we can take a look at the cost per cluster. And then there's kind of a few different items here to account for. One is a build cost. And this is looking at what you're actually using tied to an overall cost. And then we have a recommendation cost. And this is what, if you adjust those different requests, you might be scaling up to spend more money, or you might be scaling down to spend less money. And that's ultimately this recommendation difference. So you could be driving a performance increase, or you could be driving some savings in the organization. And when you look at kind of the at scale problem, if you have 10, 50, 100 clusters, and you want to understand, like I think as Elisa mentioned earlier, like, is the kind of, I guess, the juice worth the squeeze, as they say? Should you be spending time on this activity when you might be in the middle of a migration or M&A activity, or who knows where it may be for technology? There needs to be a way to understand, should I be doing this now? Should I go to my leadership and say, we need to tackle these costs now because we're going to save X dollars? And this is a way to aggregate, look at those numbers collectively right here. And one thing I want to mention as well is I did talk a little bit about, costs across your different environments here. So we can look at the cost for a namespace, and those namespaces are kind of those virtual clusters in your clusters that are there. And those could be, for the different applications, for the different teams, business units, et cetera, that are managing those clusters. Those could actually be those customers that you're wanting to track a unit cost against. So you can see what's your most expensive customer. Do you need to increase prices because it costs you a lot of money? Like, there's a lot of ways you can take a look at this. And this is where Kubernetes is really tricky, because natively in the bill, you're not going to see it. You're just going to see a bunch of instances that are tagged with cluster A, and that's great. You'll see that aggregate bill, but when you get that door knock from finance and like, hey, you're adding 20 new customers last quarter, what is each customer costing you? And you just, you just have an empty look on your face, and you need a way to confidently answer that question, because then finance will say, yeah, let's add more clusters, because there's confidence in the organization to then drive some of that behavior. So this is kind of a really cool feature from the Insights platform. Super exciting, and makes everyone's lives a little bit easier when we're talking about Kubernetes costing. And then we'll tackle one more piece. It's definitely my favorite, because when you think about a cloud center of excellence, which is made up of engineering users, operations, engineering folks, there's a lot of times where the operations team has the task of kind of federating out recommendations to the rest of the organization. And when you start to think about saving money or increasing performance, a lot of people want to know, like, you told me that things are, over provisioned, which you talked about earlier, but how do I get there? Or how can you tell me that I'm actually over provisioned? We can actually do this at the workload level. So it makes it a lot easier when you start to, federate out those results to different team members, or just driving them to the platform so they can look at it for themselves. This is really easy to look at. So if we're looking at something like core DNS, I can see there's 2 instances running here. So there's 2 pods. I can see exactly what the user set. So here's your request and limits that you've actually set. And here are your recommendations. And you can change the output of the recommendation as well. So you can say, it's a critical service. We need to account for maximum CPU values as an example, or maybe you want to use averages. You want to be real aggressive on your recommendation because maybe it's in dev and maybe it can go away because it's John's, test application. We can kind of remove that. So this is another way to not only understand impact, but really visually represent what's being set. So you don't have to, start to slice and dice, memory and CPU and make sense of this. Now you have a visual representation that everyone can look at. And then you can show the users exactly what they would save by doing that as well. So that's where that impact comes into account. So try to make it easy, try to make everyone accountable, and really start to drive those results in the organization. Excellent.
Awesome.
So that is the quick overview. And actually, one thing I just wanted to highlight as well is we did talk about labeling and all those different policies that kind of drive that behavior. So there is a policy engine within the platform as well. So you can quickly add your policies to the cluster, federate them out to all the clusters that are in your management, and ideally start to introduce standards and governance across your organization. So you want to make sure things are reliable, certain reliability checks for kind of production readiness. You can add those as well. Keep everyone secure. You can add those particular checks if you're measuring against compliance as well. And ideally start to report on those and understand who your biggest offenders. And that's an area where it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. No one likes to do it, but you have to do it. And this makes it a whole lot easier for everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I love that last piece because you can't have a FinOps strategy at the end of the day. Like you can't get to that run phase without governance, without policy of some kind, because you have to be able to say like, you can't deploy stuff into this cluster without that label anymore, because that's how we track it. Because if we don't enforce that at any point, and we don't push that, back into the code, then what are we doing? Like, how do we keep up with that stuff? So that's my favorite thing about it.
Yeah, it's fun to have those conversations sometimes when you talk to people about, how do you track your costs? Like, oh, I tagged today. Well, how much of your infrastructure is actually tagged? They're like, 15%. You're like, well, there's a little bit of a gap there. So that's fairly common. Yeah, a little bit. And that's super common. Hear that all the time.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I just want to share that Fairwinds Insights, the platform that John was just showing, is a FinOps certified solution. So we got several of our folks certified. We had an in-depth evaluation done by the FinOps Foundation, and their governing body voted. I don't know if it was unanimous or not. I was going to say unanimously, but I didn't know if that was true or not. But they voted to approve us as a FinOps certified solution. So just a few of those out there these days in the Kubernetes category, and we are definitely one of them. Fairwinds Insights, as John mentioned, we can just touch a little bit more on all the different things that it does. It is a very big platform. It does a lot of different things, has a lot of different capabilities, but security, cost optimization, and then policy and guardrails together, all in one wonderful pane of glass. And the last thing that I will share is we have a white paper out there on optimizing your costs. So if you're interested in reading more and you want more information about optimizing Kubernetes costs, go ahead and download that and have a read. I believe, Dave just shared we will be sending that out to everybody who attended. So thank you for attending. John, Elisa, it's been wonderful. Any last thoughts to share?
Thanks for leading the charge here, Andy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks all.
Awesome. All right. And I will hand it back over to Cody. I think he has some gift cards to hand out to y'all. And thank you all for listening.
And thank you so much, Andy, Elisa, and John, for being here today. I'd like to remind everyone that this session was recorded. So you should be receiving a link to access this recording on demand shortly after we conclude today. But you can also find it living on the Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars. So on to those 4 gift cards to give away. These are for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, as always. Our first winner is Madhu K. Our second winner is Gene C. Our third winner is Ashish G. And our fourth and final winner is Sudharsan S. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card, but if you don't happen to see that email, do check your spam folder. I'd like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's program, and to everyone who's joined us for the last hour, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate and value your time, but we also value your feedback. So as soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. Let us know what you liked about today's program. Let us know what you'd like to see on future programs, and we'll definitely take that into consideration. We'd love to hear back from you. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming TechStrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day. And again, Andy, John, Elisa, thank you so much.